Welcome to Catholic Comments. I'm John O'Keefe.
And I'm Wendy M. Wright. Our guest today is Father John Crossin. Father Crossin is an oblate of St. Francis de Sales. He's here today in his more official capacity as the Executive Director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Welcome, John.
Well, happy to be here and join with you in this little conversation.
Well, we're here today, as Wendy mentioned, to talk about ecumenism. And I think a good place to start would be, well, first of all, to define what that is. And then maybe talk a little bit about how ecumenism was not really a part of the Catholic experience before Vatican II.
Well, ecumenism is commonly referred to as the search for Christian unity. The word ecumenism is used broadly for any relationship between members of the Catholic community and any other religious group, but its actual technical meaning is a search for Christian unity, search with our fellow Christians to become one, as Jesus asked us to in his famous talk at the Last Supper, where he prayed that all the disciples would be one.
So, ecumenism is you're involved as the executive director for the U.S. Catholic bishops of that office. You're here on Creighton's campus particularly to be present at our conference, continuing our discussions about Vatican II, and in this particular case, the decree on ecumenism, which came out of Vatican II. So can you say something about that?
Which presumes that there was some decree that needed to happen because there wasn't any dialogue going on, right? So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, what was going on? I grew up in the 50s in Philadelphia, as your listeners can hear in my voice. And in those days, we did not go into Protestant churches at all. And they did not come into ours. Now, we played sports together every day, Protestant and Catholic boys in our neighborhood, but we would never go into one another's churches. And the change was in Vatican II. The document was approved in November of 1964 that changed the whole landscape. And that changed because Pope John XXIII, less than 3 months after he was elected Pope in January of 1959, said he would call an ecumenical council, and one of its purposes would be Christian unity.
And so, as I understand it, that the Catholics referred to Protestants before the council as heretics, right, rather than Christians. Or I mean, there was some doubt as to the authenticity of their Christianity.
Well, certainly, there had been strife since the Protestant Reformation, and so the whole tone was oppositional. It varied, however. St. Francis de Sales, for example, patron of my community, was noted for his gentle approach in dealing with the Protestants, which got stronger and stronger the longer he lived. But generally speaking, there was conflict. However, in the early 1900s, among the Protestants themselves, and in 1920 among the Orthodox, there was an openness then to coming together, realizing that Jesus did not wish us to be separated, but together. And that, by the 50s, started to influence certain Catholic circles who thought that was a good idea. And one of the people influenced was Pope John XXIII.
So I think an important part of this discussion is the recognition that not only would people come together, but that they really had, for a long time, developed different perspectives on the Christian life, different kind of doctrinal stances, different foci, and dialogue then becomes an important. What do you not only let's have a party together, but really dialogue and try to understand one another and where we converge, where there are points of difference. And can you say something about how that decree facilitated that kind of dialogue?
Well, the decree urged us to move towards Christian unity. And so immediately afterwards, in this country, right after the council, and a couple instances just before its end, Catholics and Protestants in this country set up dialogues. In fact, next May, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Lutheran Catholic Dialogue in the United States. And shortly thereafter, in a year or two, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Methodist Catholic Dialogue. So it began almost immediately. Now, as scholars will tell you, you have to build relationships to have dialogue, so you have to get to know each other, and that's not a short-term process. So you get to share, first of all, perhaps about yourself, your family, life in your community, moving on then maybe to deeper issues, and finally maybe even sharing your spiritual journey, your vocation, and the like. So there was the building of the relationships, and also there was many, many issues on which we diverged or thought we did. And they began to address those issues.
Let me ask this before we talk maybe a little bit more about what some of those issues were. Certainly we've talked on this program already about how when Pope John called the council, there was initial skepticism and even outright resistance in some circles in the Curia. But as the council was unfolding, how was this idea of ecumenical dialogue received within the council itself? Was there resistance, excitement?
Well, first of all, there was a lack of knowledge. So the Pope, before the council, he asked Cardinal Bea to direct a group of people who would prepare a document on ecumenism. And those people also then reached out to the Protestant side. And then Pope John XXIII decided to have Protestant observers at the council who had input in off-the-record sessions and conversations. And so people were being educated to what our colleagues in the faith really believed by their highest level representatives who were sent to the council, and by our own team of people who were experts. And so it was a gradual, this is what we're going to say. And then there were many drafts of the decree on ecumenism. It was drafted and redrafted for 3 or more years before it came to its final form in November of 1964.
Now, does this document actually address particular issues between Catholics and different groups of Protestants, or is it more of a call for dialogue?
Well, it does address certain issues, say with the Orthodox churches or the Protestants in the West and so forth. It points out certain things, but it also sets a different tone. That is, we will pray together, not separately. We will look for the best in one another as we attempt to resolve our differences. So part of it was a change in tone, but part of it is the beginning of the addressing of some substantive issues.
And it seems that in some ways we can point to the success of that effort, because we almost now take it for granted that we can pray with others. So the Pope has prayers routinely with leaders of Jewish communities, prays with Muslims, he prays with Protestants, he prays with the Ecumenical Patriarch. So there's that kind of success. What about in the vexing issues of theology that maybe were really divisive? I can think like right now of, say, justification by faith, which is one of the great historical divisions between Lutherans and Catholics.
Certainly intercommunion as well is another issue.
Right. Well, certainly, as one scholar points out, Dr. Susan Woods said recently in an article, we took the easier cases first, which is how ecumenism works. Work on the easier things we think will be easier to resolve, to prepare to resolve harder things. However, on justification, we came to an international agreement with the Lutherans, which has been since signed on to by the World Methodist Council. So one of the premier issues of the Reformation we've come to agreement on, and that has happened in less significantly in a variety of other areas. And so there has been significant progress. Some of it is not widely known. But
it might be worth just pausing a second. That the justification, of course, is the idea of, are we saved by faith or works? And this has been, over the last 500 years, such a cause of contention, really, between Catholics and Protestants. And so what you're saying is that issue has largely been resolved.
That issue has largely been resolved. And I should underline that part of the resolution happened in the 80s in the dialogue in the United States, which was then passed on, along with work being done in Germany, to the international dialogue, which made the agreement. So we're not far away from this. We've had a hand in it. Our work here in this country has not been insignificant.
That's very impressive. Are most of then the remaining issues mostly about polity or structure or the way we organize?
The remaining
ourselves?
issues tend to be issues of the organization of the church. and then the ministries of the church flowing out, the ministries of the church. And that is where we are working now. But we are encouraged. There is progress being made step by step. We've gotten many things cleared away. Some things were not even differences. They were differences in perception. They weren't real differences when people got into understanding one another more thoroughly and not being in a conflict mode, but being in a how can we understand each other better mode. But now the issues are surfacing, and we're working on them. It's a little bit of an uphill climb, but there are not that many left.
So the main ones would be, say, the role of bishops, the role of the Pope, those kinds of things, the priesthood.
Who is ordained?
Right, who is ordained. Those are significant issues. There's a few others. And there are different issues with different groups because the Protestants differ among themselves. And then the Orthodox are different. We don't differ that much with the Orthodox, except, again, on authority. But we both have authority structures. It's just the universal ministry of the Bishop of Rome and some other related matters.
Are there, coming out of this wonderful energy that came out of the Second Vatican Council, are there actually dialogues between Protestant groups as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
The Protestant groups in this country are talking to one another regularly, and we keep abreast of their conversations because we don't have to resolve everything between us. If they've resolved it, we can adopt it. So we're all in this together. Now, let me digress just for a minute from this topic and say I want the listeners to know that it's not all on the theological level. There is a huge amount of collaboration at the local level in feeding the homeless, in working for social justice, the betterment of the community. And yes, there are even conversations about theology, but they're not separate. They're together. Once we've broken down the barriers, then we collaborate at a host of levels, and that is increasing as well.
Right, and that Pope Francis really echoes that kind of concern as well.
And that's, I think, important for people like me to remember, because I'm a theologian, and we tend to think everything is ultimately comes down to getting the ideas right. But sometimes you really just have to work side by side with people to overcome differences.
Right. And that is one of Pope Francis's emphasis. He said, if we can walk together and respect one another and work together for those in need, that will also help us with our theological dialogue.
Yeah, certainly Christian, justice, the question of justice and the ill-distributed wealth of the world and the suffering of the poor is something that all Christians can agree about, and certainly the collaboration is much needed, I would think.
Oh, right, and it's surprising convergence. In this country, we kind of draw a distinction between the evangelical Protestants and the mainline Protestants, but on some of these social justice issues, there is a lot of convergence going on, say on mass incarceration, that there are too many people in prison, and we've given up on the idea of rehabilitation of people and just have people being warehoused in many instances, and there's a broad agreement. No, this does not respect human dignity. Let's work together for a better system.
Is immigration another issue that tends to foster cooperation?
Right. There is widespread approach. The Catholic bishops belong to Christian churches together, which is 36 churches plus many affiliated organizations. And that group cuts across the spectrum from evangelicals and Pentecostals through mainline Protestants, Orthodox, the Catholics, and the black churches. And there's this consensus in that group about immigration and about mass incarceration, that we need to work for human dignity and for the good of individuals, and we're better off when we're working together.
Well, I think this is there's a lot of things I did know that you're saying, but there are things I didn't know, and I'm finding that this really encouraging that Christians are working together on so many critical issues of our time, and I'm glad that we have this chance to maybe publicize that and get the word out a little bit. This is really good news that we often don't hear about.
Oh, absolutely. It's very positive. And it's still rolling out step by step.
Let me ask one final question, just as a clarification. I think our listeners may sometimes confuse, say, ecumenical conversation, which is between Christians,
Right.
with interreligious conversation, which is dialogue with, say, Muslims and Jews.
Right.
And how are these related, in your view, to what happened at Vatican II?
Well, there was a separate document whose anniversary is this year in October of 2015 on interreligious dialogue. It's known by the Latin title Nostra Aetate. The difference is, of course, with the other religions, we're not going to come to unity. We're coming to mutual understanding and working for the common good. Whereas with the fellow Christians, we want to be reunited eventually as the Spirit guides us. A lot of the characteristics one needs to engage in these dialogues is the same: a listening posture, respect for the other people, seeking to put ourselves in their position and understand things from where they come from. Well, those skills and talents are found often in people, so much so that they do both. The ecumenical officer of the diocese is often the interreligious officer, too.
Right, right. And I think that's an important point, that dialogue does require a listening, an openness, an ability to be empathetic and to try to understand the other, as opposed to coming with suspicion or wanting to convince somebody of the rightness or wrongness of some position. It's a very different,
Right.
a different stance.
Oh, very much so. And it's interesting. They said if you're successful in dialogue, you could write a statement of the other's position that they recognize as being accurate about themselves.
Let me ask just one final question. How did you get into this work, and what do you find most enjoyable about it?
Well, it's divine providence, I say. And I got into it indirectly because I was educated at a time after Vatican II. But I got into it directly, actually, because two Episcopalians asked me to apply for the job of director of the Washington Consortium. They knew me. I'd worked with them. They said, why don't you throw in your name?
So this is a consortium of theological schools in D.C.
Right. It's a consortium of theological schools in Washington, and I threw in my name, and they chose me. And then I wound up at the Bishops' Conference years later. The most gratifying part is to work with the people and to get to know the wonderful people you run into. And frankly, as I was told when I was a seminarian by one of our senior priests, who was quite a traditional guy, he said how great admiration he had for one of his colleagues he had entered into dialogue with. He said he's really a true Christian.
And he was not a Catholic.
No, he was, but he said, this man, no, we might disagree on theology, but he is such a good practitioner. He said there's an admiration and perhaps even a little bit of envy.
Yeah, I think those kinds of experiences really change us. I had a really very good friend, still a good friend, in graduate school who was a very committed evangelical. And I learned a lot from him about Christianity, about everything. It was and is a really enduring friendship.
And this is what we see, of course, in Pope Francis. So many people that I deal with say, well, he lives out the gospel. This is not a facade or a speech. It's a reality, and people admire that and then often seek to imitate that.
This has been a wonderful conversation with Father John Crossin, who is the he is the director, of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, talking about ecumenical dialogue. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, happy to be here.
And this has been Catholic Comments from Creighton University.